Well, shit, Tommy exclaimed. He threw his hands up in frustration. Would have been cool if we could have known that before coming here, he scoffed, turning away from the other two. He crammed his hands in his jeans and took a few steps away. Why Tommy was pissed off was beyond him, thought Drew. He's not the one who's left feeling stood up while a rock sits in his gut. All of his plans for tonight are still on track. The girl he liked, Hannah, was standing right here, ready to go have fun. Meanwhile, Isabel had decided last minute to go out on a date with somebody else before Drew could speak to her. He knew he should have asked her for her number the last time he saw her. If he's being perfectly honest with himself, he shouldn't have assumed he could ask a girl to go with him and some of his friends to an unofficial, off-the-radar Halloween party. I'm such chicken shit, Drew thought. It's cool. Yeah, it's cool, Tommy said, finally coming back into focus. He pushed his black pretty boy bangs out of his eyes, only for them to fall back into them again. I'll call Austin and let him know, he decided. Let him know that Isabel's not coming? Does this change the plans that much? Questioned Drew, his own frustrations rising as he spoke. Yes, actually, it would have been nice for you to bring somebody. Tommy broke off when he saw some costumed partygoers arriving for the dance. This isn't the type of thing you want to come solo to, he finished in a lowered voice. Drew started to shiver standing out in the cool breeze. Wearing just a button-down and slacks wasn't enough to prevent the wind from cutting right through him. Hannah, meanwhile, looked much warmer in her purple sweater and knee-length black skirt. Instead of heels, she wore black lace-up boots. She usually dressed practically. Tommy again walked a short way off, his phone pressed to his ear and his back to Drew and Hannah as they waited for him to finish. He was speaking in a low voice to try and keep his conversation private, but Drew could pick out pieces of what he was saying. Don't blame me because she's a no-show. Yeah, well, I would have had her number. Just ask, okay? We paid for our stuff, remember? The cool breeze vanished with the rising heat Drew felt. What he was hearing was clearly Austin and Tommy blaming him for this hitch in the plans. Hannah could probably hear everything he was hearing, but she wasn't acknowledging any of it. Instead, she just stood there with her arms folded while she looked up at the moon coming out from behind the clouds. Drew decided to stare at his shoes while he thought maliciously about ruining their plans further by walking home. Honestly, that would probably fix their plans, as they'd just be able to write off an entire couple completely. Cool, so Austin's gonna handle this. They'll be here in a few minutes, announced Tommy as he returned to the group. He was in a better mood after talking with his brother, and was now back to being eager to go again. Awesome, Drew replied flatly to show his dissatisfaction. Relax, dude. That call was all to make sure you'll have a good time tonight, too. Tommy put on a cheerier tone to try and reassure his friend. I'm sorry your girl's a no-show, really, but tonight we've got plans, and you're my main man. I can't leave you out of this. He gave a hearty slap to Drew's shoulder at this. So Austin will call you when he's here then? Drew appreciated the sentiment, but wasn't feeling that same excitement now that he was probably going to be set up with one of Austin's strange friends. Nah, he wants us down by the road so we can just jump in and go. He doesn't want to pull in here and see anybody, Tommy explained. He and Hannah started walking ahead of Drew, who quietly brought up the rear with his hands in his pockets. Waiting at the curb, Drew shoved his hands into his armpits to keep warm. Tommy and Hannah stood beside him, holding hands. A few minutes passed in silence until headlights appeared coming down the two-lane road. Flashing under the occasional streetlight, they could see the boxy green body of a dirty van missing its hubcaps. It slowed and came to a complete stop in the middle of the road in front of them. The window rolled down, and the pale, narrow features and dirty blonde hair of the driver leaned out of it. Squinting eyes and a smirk just like Tommy's looked the three of them up and down before calling out to them. Get in, children. I have candy. Austin beckoned them with his creepiest voice. Only if you have my favorites, Tommy answered him as he began crossing the empty road. The sliding door opened aggressively to reveal Austin's other passengers. A tall, thin guy wearing a gray hoodie pulled up over his head had opened the door for them. "You guys are in the back," he mumbled in a low voice to them. Long black hair poured out around his face, hiding everything but his large, round nose. He hopped out and slid his seat forward, allowing Tommy to climb in first, followed by Hannah and Drew. The sour smell was strongest in the back, and was most likely coming from the brown, mismatched bench seat they were sitting on. The corduroy seat cover wasn't hiding the smell very well. The doorman put his seat back with a creak and a clunk and slid the van door closed again. "No turning back now," Austin continued his creepy charade as the van lurched forward aggressively. Looking back at the church gym shrinking behind him, Drew couldn't help but wonder if this was going to be just as uncomfortable as the party he was leaving. "You guys all know my little brother Tommy, right?" Austin had to speak loudly over the sound of the van driving. The carpet from the floor had been removed, which made for a noisy ride. "We haven't met your friend, though, Tommy," Austin asked with interest as he looked back at them from the mirror. "I'm Hannah." She introduced herself quite confidently, though Drew did notice she was holding Tommy's hand tight as she did so. "Ah, so you're Hannah," Austin taunted, while the gray hoodie chuckled darkly. "Well, I'm sure Tommy told you all about me. This lady up front here is Jessica." He gestured with a nod towards a pretty blonde girl in tight jeans, a black sweater, and the reddest lipstick, who turned to smile at them politely. "Middle row, we've got Steven and Laura." Austin continued his roll call as he took a right turn down a side street a little too fast, sloshing everybody to one side. The gray hoodie grunted hearing his name, and the round girl in the knit beanie and oversized blue coat also gave a polite wave back at them. "Hello," she said quietly. "Oh, and Drew, this is Jazz." Austin craned his body around to point directly at the red-headed girl sitting next to Laura. "Why are you pointing at me?" Jazz asked, embarrassed to be singled out. She impulsively smoothed her emerald green sweater as if finding herself under a spotlight. "Just making sure Drew sees who I'm referring to," Austin explained as if this is obvious. "You didn't point at anybody else," Jazz countered. "Yeah, you didn't point at me," Steven piped up with enthusiasm Drew didn't think he possessed. "Oh, sorry. Austin again turned his torso as far as he could to look Steven in the eye and pointed dramatically. "This is my very good friend, Steven. He's the one who first showed me the place." "Austin, watch the road!" Jessica whacked his outstretched arm with each word till he turned back in his seat. Steven, Laura, and Tommy were all laughing with Austin, and even Jessica had a smile on her face as he reclaimed the steering wheel. "Anybody else want to shout out redo?" Austin asked, looking in the mirror. "No, thank you. I'd like to live," Tommy shouted out. He's usually a very safe driver. He reassured Hannah more quietly. Drew had been in this van many times before, and each time Austin was driving was just as reckless as this time. A few more turns down small roads, and they were now out in the countryside, where if it wasn't for the moon, they wouldn't see anything. "We're here," Austin announced eerily. Drew, Tommy, and Hannah began looking out the windows to try and see where here was, but saw nothing but empty fields. Out the windshield, Drew saw the orange streetlights illuminating an old steel bridge the road crossed over. Before they reached the bridge, Austin steered them off the road to the right, and the van immediately dropped a few inches onto gravel. Hannah and Jazz both gave a shriek. "Shit!" Tommy shouted. Steven and Austin laughed at these reactions. The gravel path they were now on veered further away from the bridge and began descending below it into the gorge it passed over. The road, becoming rougher with more potholes, began shaking the van and made it jump. "Slow down, Austin," Jessica said as she grabbed the dashboard for support. "Slow down, Austin!" she shouted a second time, now getting him to tap the brakes. Reaching the bottom of the gorge, Austin threw it into park and shut the van off. "All right, party people, let's set up camp," Austin announced as doors flew open. Drew was once again reminded of how cold it was outside and how he was stupid to not bring a coat. It's hard to look cool when you're shivering. Austin and Steven opened the back of the van and began unloading the mound of supplies they brought with them. Tommy, you and Drew can set up the grill just over there. Austin pointed to a clearing in the bushes just a few feet away from the van. Tommy and Drew lugged the grill over to the spot Austin pointed at and began wrestling with the spindly metal legs to get it to stand level on the lumpy dirt. Jazz and Hannah quietly brought folding chairs and set them up, both of them looking around to take in the odd and honestly creepy place for their Halloween party. Once the grill was set up, Drew and Tommy also took in their desolate surroundings. The moon was once again obscured by the clouds, making the night even darker. The bridge stood imposingly just 100 yards away. Its 3 orange streetlights hanging from its upper structure were casting long shadows and stripes of light across the gorge, making it difficult for their eyes to properly adjust to the darkness. "How'd you find this place?" Hannah asked Austin, who was busy lighting the grill. Steven and I found it one night while driving out here. We got a flat just where the gravel started, and decided to take a little look while we waited for my dad to come bring us spare. Ow! Austin shook his hand as the grill whooshed to life. "We came back a few nights later, and turns out this place is super cool for cookouts and camping and stuff." Steven finished for Austin, but trailed off when he felt he was saying too much. He turned back to a small folding table and began cutting open packages with a chef's knife. "Sure has ominous vibes out here," Jazz noted quietly. Drew jumped a little, not realizing she was standing just beside him. She didn't acknowledge him, but instead kept her eyes locked on the bridge. "We'll take a closer look up there a little later." Austin noticed where she was looking and smiled at her interest. "It's pretty fun to poke around. Right now, though, Chef Steven will indulge us with some of his famous brats." "Dude, this place is fucking cool." Tommy punched Drew's arm. He sounded genuinely excited to be here, while Drew felt more like Jazz, and maybe Hannah. This place felt creepy. Not wanting to sound ungrateful or like a mope, Drew kept his feelings to himself and feigned interest too. "The bridge is spooky, man," he said, just loud enough for Tommy and Jazz to hear. "Right? That'll be awesome." "Especially with Hannah," Tommy whispered while pounding Drew's shoulder with his fist. Austin lit 4 tiki torches around the chairs to give them a bit more light. The brats were sizzling on the grill while Chef Steven flipped them by stabbing his knife into them one by one. "Just brats?" asked Laura as she looked down into the pan. "No, there's ketchup and mustard and relish," Steven explained as he kept stabbing and flipping. "That's it?" exclaimed Laura. Her hands were on her hips like a disapproving mother. "Buns, too," Steven added lamely. All the guys laughed at his answer. "It's bachelor food, Laura. It's what we get for leaving these 2 in charge of dinner." Jessica sighed and walked back to the van. "So I'm supposed to load up on sausage then, am I?" Laura wasn't finished with Steven just yet. "I mean, I hope so." Steven's answer was barely out of his mouth before Austin and Tommy busted out laughing. Drew and Jazz exchanged knowing looks, but also snickered. "Fucking pigs, all of you," Laura spat back, before landing a softened punch on Steven's chest. Steven pulled her in for a tight hug, all while still laughing at his own joke. "Honestly, I love sausages, so I'll be fine," Hannah said sincerely. She thought she could steer them away from dirty jokes, but her sincerity didn't change anything. "Damn, Tommy, she loves sausages," Austin said, surprised and impressed. "Don't lose this one," Steven chimed in. Okay, Hannah said in exasperation. Tommy, while still laughing, grabbed her hand and pulled her close to him so he could whisper something to her that Drew didn't hear. Drew looked over at Jazz and raised his eyebrows in a "this is kinda awkward" way. She returned the expression, but with more of an understanding smile. "I had a feeling these guys wouldn't think of us, so I made brownies. Nothing special, but I thought I'd bring something to share." Jessica returned from the van with a plastic container in her hand. "Brownies?" Steven whipped around hearing the word. Austin's interest was also piqued and looked hungrily at the container. Jessica, my hero! Austin shouted as he walked towards her, rubbing his hands together. Before he could grab any, she pulled them away from him. Just brownies. Nothing special in them, Jessica informed him and everybody listening. Not like last time, she added, quieter. Austin stopped walking and processed the words she was saying for a minute before continuing. Oh, well, they're still really good. You make great brownies. Austin held his arms open and smiled, as if this news didn't upset him a little. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen. There's something else on the menu this evening that has been graciously provided by Tommy and Drew. Sorta, announced Stephen. He turned away from the group and leaned over the cooler from beside his prep table. Standing up again, he held up in the flickering light a glistening brown glass bottle. What is it? Hannah asked, curiously. The older kids in the group laughed while Stephen pulled out a bottle opener and popped the top. After taking a big swig, he wiped his mouth on his sleeve and presented it like a game show prize. This, dear child, is an Imperial IPA. 11% too. Stephen read the label aloud. You bought this? Hannah turned on Tommy, but with more surprise than disappointment. No. Drew and I gave him money to buy our way in tonight. Tommy explained himself quickly. They decided to use it to buy refreshments is all. A drink for you two gentlemen, and one for your ladies as well. Austin had popped the top on a few beers and beckoned Tommy and Drew over to collect them. Tommy swooped his up excitedly, while Drew picked his up like they were live grenades. Dude, I always wanted to try one of these. Tommy held them up in the light, admiring the artwork on the bottle. Cheers, man. Drew quickly clinked one of his bottles with Tommy's, then turned back to the empty seat next to Jazz. Here you go, Drew said quietly as he held a bottle out for her to take. She took it without hesitation and smiled at him. Thank you, she said before taking a long drink. Seeing the look on his face, Jazz giggled. First time? She asked him while patting the empty seat beside her. Yeah. Drew was sheepish to answer, but was honest as he noticed everybody else was preoccupied. He took the seat beside her. That's okay. We all start somewhere. To be honest, my first drink was only last summer, she confided in him. It was pretty fun, though. I didn't start on this stuff, though. This is kind of dry. Dry? Drew questioned, not understanding the term. Bitter. Best take some small sips at first, Jazz told him and clinked her bottle to his. Cheers. And she took another drink. Putting the bottle to his lips, a cold liquid poured in. Drew involuntarily shuddered at the bitter taste and felt his face pucker as he swallowed. He smacked his lips to try and figure out what flavor he was tasting, but he couldn't pin it. You okay? Asked Jazz, who had been watching him the whole time. Drew gave his sheepish smile again. Sure is unique, he said as he went for a second drink. Some are better than others. This one's just okay, honestly. I've had better. Jazz took another long swig like it was a water bottle. Drew thought it tasted rotten and unsafe to drink. You'll get used to it eventually. After a few swigs, Drew started to feel a warmth glowing out to his limbs. Whatever nerves he had started to melt away as he drank. Stephen's brats were finished, and everybody gathered around to get one. Even Laura and Jessica, who had also loosened up after a few bottles. They ate and drank and laughed at every dumb thing everybody said. Drew and Tommy kept high-fiving each other randomly, which would make Austin laugh at how dumb they probably looked. Neither of them seemed to care, though. Looking to his left, Drew saw Jazz smiling and shaking her head at him. This just made him wiggle his eyebrows at her, and acted generally goofier than usual. Any pretense of playing it cool tonight were thrown out, because this bitter stuff was actually pretty cool. To think he was feeling stressed and hurt that Isabel didn't come to that lame-ass dance earlier. Whomever she's seeing tonight, there's no way she's having as much fun as he is right now. With the food eaten and drinks being drunk, Austin stands up with a grunt to address the group. Now that our bellies are full of beer and brats, he begins dramatically. Wearing a woven blanket as a cape, his announcement has an air of drama to it. And the greenhorns have been initiated properly. He waves his hands over towards Drew, Tommy, and Hannah, the latter two sitting under a blanket with their heads leaning together. It's time to go to the bridge, Austin triumphantly proclaims. The bridge. The bridge! Stephen and Laura shout in unison. Yes. You ready? Tommy asks Hannah, who nods as she stands up with him. The group hoist themselves up out of their seats and begin making their way to the large, dark figure of the bridge. Tommy tucked a rather large and unwieldy, tattered blue comforter under his arm. Drew took a lumbering step off to his right as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He hadn't felt anywhere near this dizzy while sitting down. Watch that first step, a voice warns, as a hand grabs his arm to steady him. He looks around to see Jazz holding him up. Wow, thanks. Drew says this a little more loud and enthusiastically than he probably meant for it to be. Stephen and Laura snicker, hearing the interaction behind them. Knew you two would hit it off. Laura smiled back at them knowingly. Drew felt a hot flush come over his face, while also smiling stupidly. He couldn't seem to keep his composure any more than he could keep from tripping. He noticed Jazz was laughing too, but kept a firm grip on his arm. Come on. I'll have to keep you from falling to your death, she told him while linking arms. After that first bumbling step, he was better able to walk, and with Jazz helping steer him in the right direction, this afforded him the ability to look around more. The long stripes of orange light revealed the short, bristly bushes scattered along the dry, dusty floor of the ravine. The shadows cut sharply, plunging anything beyond the light into near total darkness. The outlines of the bushes against the dark walls of the gorge made for eerie sights and tricks on the mind. A few occasions, he'd see the outline of a person walking along with them just beyond the light. Ow! Fuck! Came a shout from up ahead. Babe, are you okay? Jessica's voice asked. Yeah, I just slipped. Loose dirt, Austin replied. Careful up here, he shouts back to the others. Dusting off his pant leg, he tries again at climbing a narrow path up the side of the hill to the large foot of the bridge. You go first, okay? Hannah's whisper carried back to Drew. Be careful on that root thingy, Austin told Jessica. I see it too, she snapped back. Give me your hand, damn it! I don't want to slip. Laura barked at Stephen, who must have been walking with his hands in his pockets. Hey, take my hand, Jazz instructed to Drew, unlinking their arms and bringing his attention back. He took her hand and followed her up a narrow dirt path, their feet slipping here and there. In the large shadow, his eyes began to adjust some to be able to see the thin footpath that had been carved up the slope leading to the bridge. Keeping a tight grip on Jazz's hand, he walked slowly up to the large concrete foot. Austin clicked on a flashlight as he came to a stop at a metal fence blocking their way to the giant pillar. Well, shit, Jessica sighed. Cool idea, I guess. Just give me a minute, Kay? It's just a gate. Sheesh. Austin scoffed at her. He was already pulling something out from under his blanket. With a wink, he brandished a pair of bolt cutters at her. He located the padlock and got to work. Do you usually keep bolt cutters in your pants? Laura asked him. Keep lots of things in my pants. Ask Jessica, Austin replied in between grunts. Oh, shut up, Jessica hit Austin again, causing more laughter from the group. Everybody stood around Austin as he squeezed on the handles of the bolt cutters. Jessica had taken the flashlight to hold, blinding everybody in the process. Whoa, exclaimed Stephen when the light hit his eyes. So much for night vision. I'm helping Austin, Jessica defended. Don't be rude, Laura chided Stephen, who faked a look of hurt at this. Tommy was again whispering something into Hannah's ear, making her snort at something funny. Laura and Stephen were shuffling around, looking at something on the ground. But that wasn't the only shuffling Drew heard. He heard the crunch of footsteps approaching from behind them. His fuzzy brain didn't sense anything odd at first, till he did a quick head count to find everybody already standing in front of him. He and Jazz were at the back of the group. Somebody else was coming. Drew whipped around on the spot and strained his eyes to try and see who might be coming up the darkened path. The light made it hard to see in the darkness. "What?" asked Jazz. She also turned to look at what he was looking at. "Did you—" she started, but stopped and tilted her head at the path behind them, trying to hear something. The footsteps slowed, almost as if they were trying not to be heard. "Sounds like—" Drew started, but before he could finish, the footsteps stopped. Whatever it was had stopped moving. The two of them stood silently peering into the darkness, waiting for any signs of movement or sound. Supposing it was nothing, Drew was about to turn back around when... "Shit!" Drew shouted as he lost his footing and fell backwards. Something tall and thin and black stepped out of the darkness just less than 5 feet from them. "The hell's going on over here?" the low voice of Stephen asked. He turned on the spot and flooded the ground with his own light to see Jazz laying on top of Drew in the dirt. Drew's head was spinning as he lay flat on his back. Jazz hopped right up into kneeling beside him and whipped her head back to the path behind them. Drew forced himself to sit up and look too, both of them ignoring the comments from the others. "Hey, you good, man?" asked Tommy from behind him. "He's drunk, Tommy," Austin answered for Drew. "He's a skinny guy like you, and it's his first time, so it'll hit kind of hard." "You guys didn't see that?" Jazz asked in a half-whisper. She didn't take her eyes off the path when she spoke. "See what?" Hannah asked. She too was now looking down the path with apprehension on her face. "Something was there. Right there," Drew explained. Nobody said or did anything for a moment as they too watched for something to appear. "I don't see anything," Stephen noted, unimpressed. "Yeah, same," Tommy added quickly. "It was probably our lights moving around," suggested Jessica, who was still holding hers for Austin. "It was right there, though." Jazz pointed back along the path, but nobody responded to this. "Bam! We're in," Austin announced as the padlock fell with a dull thud. "Hell yeah!" Tommy cheered drunkenly, making Hannah laugh yet again. "About time. Those cutters suck ass." Stephen nitpicked Austin as they walked through the gate one by one. "They're brand new," defended Austin. "Okay, so your arms suck then," Stephen decided. "Strong enough to kick your ass," Austin threatened with a flex. "Strong enough to climb, or am I going first?" interrupted Jessica. "All right, move over." Austin wrapped his blanket around his neck like a scarf and planted his boot on the first rung. Shifting left and right, then leaning on it till he was satisfied with its strength, Austin reached up and grabbed the rung above his head and began to climb. About 2 body lengths up, he called down, "Start climbing or we'll be all night." Jessica was next, who also tested the ladder with her foot before ascending. Stephen and Laura were after her. "Hey." Tommy grabbed Drew by the shoulder and spoke in a more serious tone. "You good to climb this? 'Cause it's cool if you want to get some water first and wait a minute." Tommy's eyes looked funny to Drew, even in the little light they stood in. He figured his eyes must also look equally out of focus and wide as his. "Yeah, I'm sure I can do it," Drew assured him. "I'm going to take it slow, stop if I need to." "Hope so, 'cause I want to see you at the top," Tommy said with a hard slap. He turned and began climbing the ladder without the caution the others seemed to take. As Hannah was climbing, Jazz ushered Drew towards the ladder. "I'll go after you," she told him. "Why?" Drew asked, honestly confused at first. "'Cause I want to make sure you don't fall back down," she said. Drew noticed her eyes darting between his eyes and the path outside the gate. He too looked back. "You sure?" he whispered to her. "Yeah," Jazz answered after a pause. "Now start climbing, tipsy boy." "Pfft, tipsy boy." Drew scoffed at the nickname, but smiled stupidly at it. Grabbing the rough, rusty metal rung above him, Drew looked straight up into the tunnel of steel surrounding the others. He could feel their vibration in his hands as he hoisted himself up. A few rungs in, and he looked back down to see Jazz beginning her climb. Hand over hand, Drew climbed while staring at the concrete wall right in front of him. He knew he was high enough up now that looking around would probably freak him out. So instead, he just watched the rungs pass by as his arms and legs did the work for him. As long as he did this, he felt just fine. Eventually, his hand didn't find another rung, but instead was gripped back by another hand. "Welcome aboard," said Tommy, as he helped his friend up onto the steel-grated walkway spanning the length of the bridge. Only a few feet wide, with handrails that felt flimsy to the touch, Drew felt very unstable up here. "Oh, here!" Drew turned to see Jazz reaching the top rung and offered his hand to her. She took it and climbed up beside him. "Cool," she said, walking ahead of him. There was more of a breeze up here, which to Drew made it feel more like a swaying rope bridge. "Come here." Jazz turned around to see Drew still standing by the ladder. Drew carefully walked to her outstretched hand and took it. "Don't want you falling up here," she explained as she pulled him close to her. She must have felt him shivering doing this, but her warm sweater felt very inviting. They walked cautiously along the walkway, every once in a while causing an uneasy creak or moan. To their right was the open air and the view to the ground marked by the long ribbons of light. To their left were large concrete walls and a ceiling above them, metal conduit running along the surfaces. "Guess we're not the first ones up here." Drew pointed at some graffiti scrawled along the wall between the pipes. "Afraid not." Jazz ticked her tongue in mock disappointment. Together they strolled along, trying to figure out what each tag was trying to say. Most weren't legible, but every once in a while a swear word or slur would stand out and they would mock it. "That's the third one that's spelled incorrectly." Jazz pointed at red, jagged letters, misspelling an insult towards somebody named Tiny Mike. "Oh, there's more above us," Drew noticed, looking straight above them. Blue spray paint scrawled the words, "She's calling me," with an arrow pointing further down the walkway. "I don't see any she," commented Jazz as they walked further down, scanning the ceiling for who she might be, until they found another paint job. Again on the ceiling was graffiti, but this time instead of words, it was a face, an unpleasant face to look at. Expressionless, she looked down on them. Pale skin and pursed lips, wild black hair surrounding her face to obscure the edges of the portrait. Yet what drew the most attention were the eyes. Whomever made this work clearly spent their time on the eyes to get them just right. Dark and hollow, with a faint yellow glow so deep within them you could barely see where the pupil was. Despite the shrouding darkness in them, they gave a harsh, piercing stare, one directly aimed at anyone who stood beneath her and looked up. The look gave Drew a cold chill that ran down his spine. The ominous feeling of being watched was flooding back into his chest and prickling at the hairs on his neck. He and Jazz looked at each other at the same time to confirm they were both feeling the same thing. Upon seeing the disturbed look on each other's face, they both spun on the spot to look at the steel walkway back to the ladder. Nobody was there, but they waited a minute anyways. Nobody was making a sound anywhere. Drew just realized what was missing for a while now. Everybody else was gone. "Wanna find the others?" Drew asked Jazz, with slight alarm in his voice. "Yeah, they're not far," she agreed, self-reassuringly. They turned back around and took each other's hand to try and catch up. The galvanized path continued the length of the bridge, but off to the left were other junctions, cutting through the concrete connecting to the opposite side of the bridge. Faint orange light from the roadway above delicately illuminated the narrow cross paths. Resisting the strong urge to break into a run, they ducked into the first turn they could make. The cross path felt like a wind tunnel. Concrete walls and ceiling above them squeezed in claustrophobically. The floor beneath them was still perforated to show the height they were suspended in the air. This tunnel didn't feel any more stable than the walkway they just left. Single file, Jazz led Drew down a few feet before finding a small alcove to their right. In it, something was writhing around. Holding her breath, Jazz crept forward, but was given away by a tiny creak. The writhing stopped. Jazz and Drew froze on the spot, just a foot away from the black opening in the wall. A bright light blinded both of them instantly. "The fuck are you two doing?" asked the low voice of Stephen. He sounded irritated at being interrupted. Once his eyes adjusted, Drew could see Laura pushed up against the wall of a tiny closet missing its door. Behind them, a tall gray electrical breaker box was bolted into the wall. "Sorry," Jazz apologized quickly. The tension she felt just a moment ago already washing out to be replaced by embarrassment. Stephen held his jacket over his torso with one hand, while the flashlight was in the other. Laura was pulling her coat closed tightly. "Shouldn't you two be off doing something?" Laura added angrily. "We were looking for the others," Drew explained feebly. "Why?" Stephen scoffed. "Nobody wants to be found right now. Know what I mean?" "We were gonna ask Austin something," Drew made up on the spot, hoping not to look as pathetic as he felt right then. There was an uncomfortable pause for a second before anybody reacted. Stephen handed the flashlight to Laura and dove his hand into his coat pocket dangling around his waist. Pulling out some golden foil squares, he tore two off and held them out to Drew. "Here you go. He said you and Tommy probably weren't prepared," Stephen replied, with a cooler tone this time. Drew grabbed them to prevent the situation from getting worse. "Thanks, man," he said, and began nudging Jazz through to the other side. The light clicked off, sending the tunnel back into darkness. Stepping out onto the exposed walkway of the far side, they both sighed relief before they found themselves laughing. "That was awkward," laughed Jazz, once they were far enough away. "That was embarrassing," Drew added. "They scared the shit out of me." Jazz put a hand to her chest, speaking in a half-whisper. "Twice tonight. That better be the damn drinks." Drew sighed. Jazz laughed with him as they came to a stop. Her eyes wandered down to his clutched hand and took it in hers. Holding up the packets, she raised an eyebrow. "Generous of him to think of us, though," she noted, waving them in the air. To this, Drew had nothing to add except an uncomfortable smile. Nevertheless, he was proud that he didn't look away, looked right into his eyes, both of them smiling at each other. Placing one finger on his chest and sliding it down, Jazz found his shirt pocket and pulled it open to drop them in. Patting it securely, she turned away from him to look out over the railing at the new vista. Drew slowly let out the breath he didn't know he was holding in. "It's brighter on this side," Jazz noticed. "Look, the moon came out now." "Yeah. Why'd we camp out on the dark side?" Drew asked rhetorically. He joined her at the railing to take in the view. Standing in the moonlight gave them a feeling of comfort they hadn't yet felt this whole night. Once again, Drew felt slightly chilled without a coat, and once again, Jazz moved in closer to warm him up. Looking at her, he noticed that she wasn't watching the view at all. She was watching him, her green eyes right into his brown. Her warm, soft lips met his, and suddenly the moon wasn't worth a second glance. Drew put his hands on her hips and pulled her closer, while she put her arms around his neck. "What are you doing out there? Give me your hand. Look at me, Jessica. Look at me." Hearing Jessica's name and the panicked tone of the one shouting broke the spell of the moment, and they pulled apart to listen. Austin's voice was reverberating around the gorge below, but his origins sounded close to them. "It's okay. I've always trusted her," Jessica replied. Her voice didn't sound tense or panicked at all. She spoke calmly and clearly. "She was always there to help me. She knows what it's like. That's why she came back for me. I'm offering you help, Jess. Now come back." Austin pleaded with her, but it wasn't seeming to work. "It sounds like they're above us," Drew spoke up. They both leaned on the railing and looked up, straining to pick up on what was going on up there. "I can't leave her now," Jessica replied calmly. "She's calling me." "Jessica!" Austin screamed. A whoosh of a dark figure fell from up above them and plummeted straight down to the ground below. Jazz and Drew leapt back as it sailed past them, just maybe 15 feet out from where they stood. Jazz screamed, horrified at what she was seeing. Drew watched completely silent, his heart now beating in his throat. He watched as the figure of Jessica fell silently down and out of sight, which sent a wave of dizziness over him once again. Jazz had hooked his arm and turned him around. Without thought, he found himself running alongside her, the height of the bridge no longer bothering him. Jazz turned down the dark hallway they first came through and shouted, no longer caring who she disturbed.
"Steven! Laura!"
Her voice echoed off every surface. A grunt of dissatisfaction replied. What now? I'm not... Steven was cut off too quickly by a frantic demand. Where's your flashlight? Give me your flashlight! She demanded. Fuck, why? I don't... He sounded startled by her urgent tone, but she didn't let him finish. Jessica fell off the damn bridge, that's why! Jazz yelled at him. What? Laura had spoken up, hearing this.
Like, how? I heard her talking to Austin from up top, and she fell off the top all the way to the ground.
Jazz seemed to give up on them halfway through what she was saying, as she abandoned asking for the flashlight and went running off towards the first walkway. The flashlight clicked on behind Drew as he ran off after her, again flooding them with light. At the junction, Jazz nearly collided with a figure who was running full tilt towards the ladder.
Move!
Shouted Austin as he side-leapt around her, completely disregarding the precariousness of their height.
We saw. We're coming too.
Jazz shouted back as she kept up just behind Austin, Drew bringing up the rear. They reached the ladder where Austin dove onto his knees hard and backed down the opening. Jazz was so close that she nearly stepped on his hands. Breathing fast and heavy, they climbed down as fast as they could, but it was still painfully slow. Finally reaching the bottom, Austin fumbled in his pockets while still moving towards the gate. Pulling out his own flashlight, he began waving it around frantically while shouting.
Jessica! Jessica!
His voice strained as he called for her. Drew and Jazz didn't say anything. They just ran wordlessly, arms flailing like windmills as they stumbled through the bushes down the slope away from the bridge. Between Austin's flailing beam of light and Drew's continuing buzz, he was beginning to feel even more nauseous than he already felt. The image of somebody free-falling into the darkness played on loop in his mind, making his stomach churn. Directly beneath the bridge, Austin slowed to a jog. He swept the ground a bit more methodically now as he searched for Jessica. All three would look up every couple of seconds to see if they were in the right place. They spun on the spot a few times, pointing the light at every bush and rock. Nothing. They couldn't find any trace of her. Drew was terrified of what he would find any second now. He knew that a fall from that height wasn't going to end well. Despite his apprehension of seeing his first corpse, he started to feel more confused than scared. There was no body or heap of twisted mess. No clothes or shoes. Not even blood was on the ground. It should have been, Jazz started to say, but trailed off as she looked out further, widening her search. She went straight down, she finished. Austin's face, now reddened from the frantic dash, began to glisten with tears as he slowly scanned the horizon with his flashlight.
Jessica!
He shouted till his voice cracked. All three were suddenly illuminated by another light and the sounds of frantic footsteps approaching. Hey, man. Steven huffed into view, followed a few feet back by Laura.
Is what she said for real?
He demanded of Austin, his finger pointing at Jazz off behind him.
She fucking walked off the bridge.
Austin choked the words out, difficult to believe them even as he spoke.
Straight down. She should be here.
Austin pressed his hands to his head as he screamed, frustration and fear boiling inside him and needing a way out. Okay, fan out, everybody, Laura commanded, trying to bring back order to the situation. I know you saw what you saw, but maybe she drifted away. Austin wordlessly nodded and began marching away from the others, sweeping his light meticulously along the ground in front of him. Steven and Laura began searching the opposite side of the bridge, while Jazz and Drew walked the length of it in the other direction. Drew's hands were shaking violently as he pulled out his phone and fumbled for the light. Jazz had hers out, and with a look and a nod, they started walking and sweeping for any clues of Jessica. It didn't take long for them to feel like they walked too far away from where she should have landed, but they kept scanning. "You hear what she said before falling?" Drew asked cautiously, not sure how Jazz would react to this question. When she didn't reply, he swallowed hard. "She said somebody came back for her. That she knows what it's like. I don't know." She and Drew kept walking for another moment before Drew continued. "Last thing she said was, 'She's calling me,'" Drew added, looking at Jazz for any signs of recognition. Jazz stopped walking and looked at Drew, disturbed by what he said. She understood what he was alluding to, though, as she then looked up at the black form of the bridge above them. "But it was..." Jazz started, but then stopped, not wanting to finish her own thought. "I've been feeling a weird feeling," Drew confessed. Jazz met his gaze again, hearing this. Her jaw was tight as she looked at him with worry. "Ever since somebody came up behind us," Jazz admitted. They stood at a loss of words for a solid moment in silence. The chilly breeze blew subtly again, just enough to give Drew the chill he felt earlier. The brush all along the ground began to rustle, drawing their attention back to their surroundings. Drew's heart rate quickened again as they both looked around for any signs of movement, anticipating a second visit. The silence was broken, off in the distance.
Jessica!
Austin's light was waving wildly again as he ran away from the bridge deeper into the brush. They caught glimpses of him as he passed through the beams of orange light. Stephen and Laura were already trailing some 50 feet behind him. Drew and Jazz started towards him as well, riding at an angle across the gorge. Closing the gap somewhat, they could see Austin weaving through the plants and leaping over larger ones.
Austin! Stop! She's not out here.
Laura was shouting in between breaths as she struggled to keep pace with him.
That's her. Right out there.
Austin shouts over his shoulder as he pointed into the darkness ahead of him. He ripped off his blanket with his free hand and threw it behind him. He even dropped his flashlight without a second thought.
Jess! Tell me how far!
He called ahead of him, but heard no answer.
You're freaking me out, man. You gotta stop!
Stephen called after him. Jazz and Drew slowed down when their eyes adjusted without the flashlight waving around. Running further ahead of Austin was a dark figure of what appeared to be a woman. She made no sound and didn't seem to run with any difficulty despite the natural obstacles all around them.
Of course I'm coming with you.
Austin answered nobody.
I'll follow you anywhere. Just wait for me.
With his long legs, Stephen was closing in fast on Austin. Laura had fallen behind a short while ago.
Where do you think you're going?
Panted Stephen between breaths.
I can't leave her, man.
Austin explained.
She's calling me.
Stephen nearly had Austin by the shirt collar before he tripped on an unseen rock and fell hard. Drew slid to a stop so as not to trip on Stephen lying in the dirt, cradling his elbow. Jazz passed them both, but came to a stop as the wind suddenly and aggressively changed direction. The bushes and shrubs rattled their dry limbs as the air funneled violently towards Austin's back as he faded into the eerily thick darkness. Jazz's hair flipped over her head and into her face, while her coat billowed around her like a sail. Flipping it back, she looked and listened for Austin. Just as quickly as it came, it stopped. The night air was almost still again. There weren't any sounds for nearly a full minute. She couldn't hear anybody running anymore. Drew stood over Stephen, who stared as hard as he could into the darkness, straining his ears for any sound. Stephen winced, bringing Drew's attention back. "Sorry, man. You hurt?" Drew offered his hand to help him up. "My damn elbow. Fucked it up," moaned Stephen. Drew helped him back on his feet as Laura ran up to take over.
Austin?
Jazz called out cautiously to the darkness ahead of her. Her whole body was rigid as she spoke, her hands balled into fists as she fought the urge to turn and run. No answer came. "Jazz," Drew called out to her. She didn't answer him. "Jazz!" he repeated as he jogged over to her. She didn't acknowledge him until he was right beside her. "Come on, we're going back to the van right now," explained Drew calmly. She gave a curt nod, but didn't look away from the darkness. She felt as if the darkness was watching her back. "Hey." Drew grabbed her forearm and gave it a bit of a squeeze. "Don't be out here by yourself." He whispered this so only she could hear. She finally turned to see the apprehension on his face. One last look back into the shadows, then she turned and walked back with the others. It was quiet on top of the bridge. Tommy and Hannah escaped everybody else and found a place where they wouldn't be found. Ducking under the railing, they walked outside the safety of the catwalks on a steel beam to a concrete ledge hidden in the shadows. If anybody walked by, all they had to do was sit quietly and they wouldn't be seen. Tommy rolled out the large blue blanket he was carrying and made a cozy little spot for the two of them to sit together and take in the view. It wasn't long, however, until they ignored the view for each other's company. They folded the blanket over themselves to keep warm while they kissed and talked. Eventually, there wasn't much talking going on either, until they decided to come up for air. "Best Halloween I've ever had," Tommy announced as he sat up beside her. "Me too," Hannah agreed. "Way better than that dance." "Yeah, no shit," Tommy chuckled. He surveyed the gorge below, once again darkened by the clouds passing over the moon, leaving just the streetlights above. "I'm pretty glad you came," he said, turning back to her. To his surprise, she laughed at this. I mean, coming here with me." Tommy realized his slip, but laughed anyways. "I'm glad I came too," she admitted to him. They stared at each other for a moment, saying nothing. Tommy's eyebrows furrowed slightly as he scanned her face. Hannah cocked her head in wonder of what was wrong. Before he could say the words he was thinking, they both started to hear something from far below.
"Austin! Stop! She's not out here!"
Came a distant voice, softly reverberating around the gorge.
"That's her! Right out there!"
Sounded the unmistakable voice of Tommy's brother. He knew it right away. "You hear that?" Tommy asked instead. He looked down to the dark ground far below. "Is that your brother?" Hannah asked as she began looking down as well.
"Jess! Tell me how far!"
Austin's voice shouted from afar. "What are they doing?" Hannah wondered to Tommy, but Tommy shook his head, just as confused as Hannah. "Dunno. I didn't know they went back down." Tommy shrugged, but kept looking down to the ground for any movement. He didn't like the tense yelling he was hearing. He and Hannah kept very quiet so they could try and make out more words.
"You're freaking me out, man. You gotta stop."
This voice must be Steven's, Tommy thought. They do weird shit together all the time. What could Austin be doing that's freaking him out?
"Of course I'm coming with you. I'll follow you anywhere. Just wait for me."
Austin was calling out to Jessica, but they didn't hear Jessica's voice at all.
"I can't leave her, man. She's calling me."
He shouted. If anything else was said after that, it was drowned out by the sudden wind that picked up at the most inconvenient moment. Not only was it quick to come on, it was strong, too. Hannah's hair started swirling around her head, and Tommy grabbed up some blanket to shield them from its chill. As quick as it came, it subsided just as fast, leaving them in the quiet night once again. Neither of them heard any more voices after that. "Maybe we should go check?" Hannah asked him, grabbing his arm for support as she kept looking around for signs of anybody else. "Yeah, maybe," Tommy agreed. "I'll go check. You can wait here," he added after a moment's pause. "Are you sure?" she asked, concerned. "Yeah, it's fine. I'll come get you in a minute," Tommy told her as he started pulling his pants and shoes back on. "Is this some sort of macho bullshit?" Hannah's tone changed, sounding unimpressed at his insistence to go alone.
No, it's not. I just don't want to give up our cool hiding place just yet.
Tommy reassured her with a smile.
If it's nothing, I want to come right back here with you. Fine. Just don't leave me up here for long.
She called out to Tommy's back as he already started walking the beam back to the catwalk.
Hell no. I'll be back soon.
Tommy called back to her as he slipped under the bars and out of sight. Walking along the catwalk in such darkness was super fun, despite the reason he was doing it right now. Unlike Drew, Tommy enjoyed some of the risk and danger that came along with doing things like this. Austin usually took him to do things like this back when they were younger. Their mom would go to work and leave them to get into whatever trouble they wanted, as long as their mom didn't find out about the trouble. An odd wave of sad nostalgia washed over Tommy as he thought about some of the adventures he would go on. Before Steven came along, at least. We had some good times, didn't we? Austin called out from Tommy's right. Tommy stopped dead and spun to look down the dark hallway the voice came from. He flushed with fright hearing somebody else speak to him.
Oh, shit, dude, you scared me,
Tommy replied, dropping his arms back down to his side.
I thought I heard you back down on the ground.
Tommy's eyes finally focused on a dark silhouette of a person at the end of the hallway, where the dim orange light from the road above shone through.
Nah, man, I'm staying up here with you,
Austin said brightly.
We're doing this together.
Hell yeah, Tommy found himself agreeing, nodding his head proudly.
This place is almost as cool as that cave we explored that one time. You remember?
Austin asked Tommy.
Oh yeah, you took me there for my birthday,
Tommy exclaimed excitedly as the vivid memory of his 12-year-old self followed his older brother into that dark, damp cave all those years ago.
That was the coolest birthday.
Sure was, Austin agreed from down the hallway.
We didn't have everything all the other kids had, but you know what we did have?
What? Tommy asked, eagerly waiting for his big brother to answer him. We had a hell of a lot more fun than they did, proclaimed Austin.
Damn right,
Tommy heartily agreed. He took a few steps closer to the dark hallway to try and better see his big brother.
Mom did her best for us, and even though we didn't have a dad, we didn't need one. You know why, Tommy?
Asked Austin again.
Why?
Asked Tommy. His eyes were wide as he spoke, his face expressionless as he waited for the answer.
Because we had each other,
Austin finally answered him.
Whenever I needed you, you were there. I just hope that I was able to do the same for you.
He finished wistfully.
You were, Austin. You always were.
Tommy reassured his brother enthusiastically as he slowly started walking towards the dark figure.
You taught me everything I know. Whenever I was in trouble, you pulled me out of it. Even tonight. Tonight wouldn't have happened without you.
Tears began filling Tommy's eyes as he confessed these things. Even as he did, and felt a swelling pride and admiration for his brother, something in the back of his mind kept telling him that something about this isn't right. He knows what he heard down on the ground, and he still wanted answers. Steven's made it rough for you over the years. I know it has, Austin continued affectionately. Our duo's had a third wheel, and trikes aren't as fun as bikes. So what do you say to starting things over? Just you and me, on a brand new adventure together. Excitement filled Tommy to the brim. An adventure with the person he looked up to the most in life. A fresh start. Tommy wanted nothing more than to do just that. That tickle at the back of his mind was persistent, though. It kept telling him that something isn't right with Austin. Maybe the little voice was right. The dark figure with its long black hair shrouding its face didn't move the entire time it spoke. It just stared at him with its dark, unblinking eyes, pale yellow light glowing back out at him. In spite of that, Tommy couldn't resist such an opportunity as this. Austin and Tommy versus the world once again. Let's do it, Austin, Tommy pledged to the figure just before him. Adventure calls. As he spoke these words, he felt a forward lurch in his entire body.
The whole world was tipping him forward into the open arms of the figure now just feet from him. His excitement melted away in the last minute, turning into the rushing fear of falling forward as fast as he was. Fear turned to dread as he now began to realize that whom he was speaking to wasn't his brother, but something completely different. The black dress draped on their thin frame fluttered aggressively as the rush of wind flowed forward with Tommy. Its black hair billowed up and away from its gaunt face. Even in the shadow, Tommy could see it remained expressionless as it pulled him in. Its unblinking eyes, glinting with its own light coming from within, grew brighter as Tommy felt closer and closer to it. In the fleeting final moment, Tommy felt a cold chill pierce him to his core. Instead of shivering or even fighting it, he just accepted it. The colder he became, the less he cared. The glowing yellow eyes were all he saw, brighter and brighter until oddly, they began to dim. Along with it, everything else dimmed too. Tommy didn't think this was a problem though. In fact, he didn't think about anything anymore. The tiki torches were still lit when they got back to the camp. It looked like they hadn't even been gone 5 minutes. Drew saw his chair sitting empty next to the one Jazz sat in, a couple bottles laying on the ground around them. The grill was barely warm to the touch, but still smelled of the brats they cooked on it. So strange to think they were enjoying themselves here earlier this same night. Drew used Austin's flashlight to see where he was walking. He looked at it all like it was ancient ruins. Laura guided Stephen to the van and opened the back hatch. Under the sleeping bag. It's a white plastic toolbox. Stephen instructed her in her search. Got it. Give me your arm. Laura gingerly rolled up the sleeve to see the bloody scrape and swelling bruise. I'm gonna clean it, so it's gonna sting a bit. Go for it. Stephen nodded as he looked over his injury. Drew and Jazz had their backs to the van, watching for any signs of movement beyond the light. It was difficult to see past the flickering flames of the torches, but from what they could see and hear, there was nothing happening at the moment. The wrap will keep it clean, Laura explained quietly as she finished working on his arm. What do we do now? Jazz wondered to no one in particular. Nobody answered at first. 2 missing people, Stephen counted. 1 jumped, but we can't find her bug splat anywhere. Stephen! Laura chided him for sounding so insensitive. That bug splat is our friend. Yeah, I know, but we can't find it, can we? He argued back. Now Austin ran off thinking he heard her calling him, like some damn lunatic. Both of them are missing. I think we should go get help, Jazz interjected. 2 missing people, and we can't find either of them, dead or alive. And tell them what, Jazz? That we were trespassing on the bridge? Sharing alcohol with minors? Stephen pointed at her and Drew, roping them into his reasoning. So, I don't know, dish the drinks somewhere on our way? Jazz offered. They can test you for drinking, you know. Also, what about the trespassing part? We have to tell them where they went missing and why we were here. Stephen poked holes in her proposal. We're kinda on our own, I'm afraid, Laura said more gently to ease the rising tensions. Where does this gorge go? Drew asked, pointing into the darkness stretching beyond the bridge. It winds around to the far side of Gwynville. There's another bridge crossing it over there, Stephen explains, still sounding tense. How far? Drew pressed. Could we drive along it and see if we can find Austin? Stephen thought about this for a minute. He looked into the dark gorge stretching away from them, then back at the van. Let's pack this shit up first, because I'm not coming back here for it, instructed Stephen as he slammed the first aid kit closed and slid it back under the seat. Moving quickly and quietly, They gathered up the chairs and shoved them in the back of the van and started chucking all the bottles and garbage into a bag.
Leave it, Stephen told Drew.
Leave the garbage? Drew questioned.
Yes. We've got to get moving, and I don't give a shit about any of this.
Stephen snapped at him as he turned the grill on its side, spilling the smoking briquettes onto the ground. He kicked some dirt onto it with his boot to bury it somewhat. Drew ditched the black bag with all of its contents where he stood and started grabbing the torches. One by one, he put them out and stuffed them into the back of the van. Only after he snuffed out the last torch did he notice the sounds of footsteps approaching in the distance.
Jazz! Jazz!
He hissed for her urgently. She moved over to him quickly in the dark.
Listen,
he told her, and they both fell quiet for a moment. The slow march of someone kept coming towards them, though they couldn't yet see anybody.
Stephen!
Drew shushed him as he rearranged things to fit in the van better. He and Laura quieted and listened to the footsteps as well, turning to face the direction they were coming from. Out at the edge of their vision, they saw a dark black figure approaching them down the path to the bridge. It didn't look like anybody Drew recognized. Quickly and quietly, all four of them darted to the other side of the van, abandoning whatever tasks they were doing. They crouched silently as the footsteps entered their camp and came to a stop. They could hear them turning slowly on the spot, observing the traces of their camp they left out. The steps started up again as they approached the van they were hiding behind. Stephen was closest to the corner and turned to give a silent, wide-eyed look of fear to the others before turning his whole body back to face whatever it was coming their way. 10 feet away, then 7, then 5. It drew nearer until... A shriek of terror rang out through the gorge, echoing off the walls and breaking the tense silence. Drew, Jazz, and Laura darted around the corner after Stephen to find him pinning a person to the ground. Wrapped in a large, tattered blue blanket was Hannah, looking terrified at the sight of Stephen's deranged expression looming over her in the dim orange light. "Hannah!" Drew called out in relief when he saw who it was.
Get off her!
He grabbed Stephen under the arm and pulled him off, before reaching down and helping her up out of the dirt.
What the fuck is wrong with everybody?
She yelled at them. Clicking on a flashlight, he saw tears streaming down her face as she looked at each person around her.
Sorry, Hannah. We thought you were someone else.
Jazz spoke kindly as she came and put an arm around Hannah's shoulder.
Where have you guys been?
Hannah's voice was shaking.
Us? Where have you been?
Accused Stephen, still clearly pent up with tension.
Ease off, Stephen,
Laura snapped.
I take it you and Tommy have missed a lot of the action tonight.
Where is Tommy? She questioned. Looking around, nobody saw Tommy nearby.
I thought he'd be with you by now,
Hannah told her.
He left to go see what was up. We heard shouting.
Hannah was also looking around the group and noticing missing faces.
Where are they?
She asked cautiously. Nobody knew who should speak at this point, and left the question hanging in the air for a moment. Jazz was still holding on to her and decided she should explain things.
There was an accident earlier, she started cautiously. Jessica fell off the bridge. We went to go look for her, but we couldn't find anything. Hannah covered her mouth with a gasp hearing about Jessica. Austin thought he saw her and ran after her, but, well, he's missing now too.
Jazz finished lamely.
And what about Tommy?
Hannah pressed quietly, her hand moving from her mouth to her throat.
The last we saw of him was when he climbed the bridge with you,
Laura added.
But I heard him talking with Austin back up on the bridge. Didn't Austin go back up?
Hannah sounded just as confused as she did scared now. Tommy wasn't around when we lost Austin, Stephen said bluntly from the back of the group. His arms were folded as he stared up at the bridge, frowning.
But he was talking to Austin. I heard him.
Hannah was adamant that they were together, and therefore not lost.
Did you hear Austin speaking back, or just Tommy?
Drew asked. He was starting to realize a pattern. Hannah thought for a moment before answering. No, I only heard Tommy. He sounded excited about something. Hannah spoke slowly as she recalled what she heard. Everybody else stared and listened to her with bated breath. Even Stephen turned back to face her.
You sure he was talking to Austin?
Questioned Stephen, making sure he understood her correctly. Yeah, he said his name. He said, "Let's do it, Austin." Hannah reaffirmed her story. The looks on everybody's faces weren't helping her fear and anxiety.
That's twice somebody was talking to nobody tonight, Stephen announced, breaking the silence again.
3 times, added Jazz. Drew and I heard Jessica talking to nobody before she fell. Jazz again ended awkwardly, seeing Hannah's teary eyes begin to bug out of her head. All of this was proving to be too much for Hannah to handle, as she pulled away from Jazz to collect herself. "Tommy!" Hannah shouted unexpectedly, sending an icy wave of fear over Drew as he and Jazz moved on her. "Shh! You can't shout like that!" He scolded her as he spun her around to face him. "Something else is out here with us." "Drew, please," Jazz intervened and took back the calmer tone. "We've been hearing something following us all night just out of sight, and we don't know who or what it is. Right now, we're packing up the van to start driving further down the gorge to see if we can find the others."
Yeah, fuck that, Stephen said suddenly. It's 2 a.m. and sunrise is around 8. They can make it 6 hours without us. We'll look for them in the daylight. And with that, he started for the van.
What? Laura stood in front of him. "Our friends, your best friend is out there, and you want to bail on them?"
I don't know if you've noticed, but it sounds like each one of them was losing their minds while talking to the wind or whatever, before vanishing off the face of the earth or jumping from a fucking bridge. Stephen spat back.
"So you're spooked and want to go home?" Laura questioned, disbelief on her face.
I don't want to disappear, Stephen shouted back at her.
Drew was watching the couple fighting when he felt a sharp jab in his side. Turning to see, he saw Jazz quietly nod in the direction of the van. She was already ushering Hannah away when Laura noticed them. "Where are you guys going?" Laura asked, sounding surprised. "Look, any way you dice it, we can't stay here," said Drew, frankly. "I'm not fucking going anywhere, because I know he'll just drive away," Laura snapped at Drew. "Let's drive away along the gorge, then. None of them are here anymore anyways, so why stay?" Drew said as he walked backwards, climbing in the van.
"See, I agree with Drew." Stephen gestured enthusiastically.
"You're both cowards. Something's wrong, and at this point, it's time to call in somebody to help search," Laura said in her most disappointing tone.
"You think that Jessica's gonna walk back from that height?" Stephen pointed up at the 150-foot-tall bridge.
"Stephen, I swear to God, you're the biggest ass I've ever met," Laura spat back. Drew slid the door closed on their conversation. Sitting in the middle row was Hannah, resting her head on Jazz's shoulder. Together, they all sat in the silence of the van, just watching as they argued heatedly. Laura tried walking away towards the bridge, but Stephen kept up with her, trying to get her to stop. Their words faded further and further away. "Stupid idiots. They always fight," Jazz commented quietly, more to herself than anyone. She was bouncing her knee nervously as her eyes stayed locked onto the pair walking away. "Who's that?" Hannah piped up urgently. She was pointing at a shadowy figure walking towards them from under the bridge. Stephen and Laura clearly didn't notice as they were too busy arguing. "Oh, shit," Drew muttered. The atmosphere in the van went from one of waiting to hiding. "Whatever happens, we need to be quiet," Jazz whispered to Hannah. Hannah nodded wordlessly as she stared out the window in silent terror. The shadowed person came to a stop just 50 feet away from them and watched. The wind began to pick up, blowing its hair and dress softly. This got the couple's attention, as their shadows stopped walking and shouting and instead turned to face the other shadow. As far as Drew could see through the foggy window, neither of them seemed to move or show any signs of fear. They were now a good 200 feet away from the van, with only their silhouettes framed by the dim orange light of the bridge. "Where are they going? Where are they going?" Hannah hissed fearfully. "Shh, quiet," Jazz reminded her. "We don't want to be noticed." Stephen and Laura now walked slowly, hand in hand towards the silhouette. The closer they drew to it, the harder the wind picked up. It howled against the van and whipped the shrubs around. When they were finally just a few feet from it, the outline of the dark figure began to expand, radiating a shadow outwards like a thick smoke flowing against the growing wind. The view of the figure was now obscured, and in another moment, Stephen and Laura were hidden as well. As soon as their bodies were completely enveloped in the darkness, it dissipated. The wind completely stopped. The dim orange light poured back out over the ground, illuminating the now empty field, devoid of any trace of them ever being out there. "I want to go, please," Hannah whispered in Jazz's ear. "Yeah, let's go," Drew agreed, and began to quietly clamber up into the driver's seat. "Where's the keys?" he asked out loud. The van was cluttered with fast food bags and wrappers strewn on the floor. The console had water bottles and candy wrappers, and the dashboard had papers, receipts, and a parking ticket on it. Drew began by flipping the visor down, but nothing was there. "Are we stuck?" Hannah asked in the quietest whisper. No, Tommy told me there's another key in here." Drew leaned over and searched the glove box, where there were screwdrivers, batteries, spare bulbs, and the owner's manual. "Tommy would steal this from Austin sometimes when he was at work. He'd go get snacks and stuff with it. I know it's here," he whispered frantically. Drew stopped for a moment and thought hard about the last time they took the van. Tommy put the key back, but where? They got something from the drive-thru just a few weeks ago and went back to Tommy's house. And when they got back out of the van, Tommy put it under the passenger seat. Drew dove his hand under the seat and found a flat piece of metal with the key magnetized to it. "Got it," Drew whispered excitedly, holding it up for them to see. "Great, let's go," Jazz urged him on, but Drew was just staring at the key, transfixed by its silver shine in the dim light. It was a lot of fun going places with Tommy. He remembered the first time they stole the van, right after Tommy got his driver's license. They had to go celebrate passing his test. Austin was off with friends or something, but the van was left behind. It was the perfect opportunity. "We got that giant pizza that night," Tommy reminded Drew. "We also got the free 2-liter for picking it up as well," Drew remembered. "Who are you talking to?" Jazz sounded panicked and didn't even bother whispering at this point. "Tommy. He's always been a cool guy," Drew explained nostalgically, twirling the key in his hand. "I've known him since we were 12. 2 little dorks at scout camp," Tommy said with pride. Drew looked up to see a dark figure with haunted pale yellow eyes through the windshield just 20 feet away. "Sure were. Man, that camp was fun," Drew's nostalgia waxing stronger. "Oh my God," Hannah squeaked when she and Jazz noticed the figure out in front of the van. The horrifying being just stared intently and motionless, while Drew stared right back at it. "We should go," Drew agreed to an unheard idea. "Don't worry, I'll come help you." Drew reached for the door handle to get out, but was pulled back by his other arm. "You're not going out there," Jazz grunted as she hefted him bodily out of the chair and pushed him towards the back seat. "Grab him! Pull his arm!" Jazz barked at Hannah, who moved quick to start tugging on his flailing wrists. "Tommy needs help! I gotta help my friend!" Drew shouted at them as he struggled. Together, they flopped him onto the middle bench, where he tried scrambling for the sliding door. Oof! Drew had the wind knocked out of him as Hannah pounced onto his back, pinning him down to the seat. "Where's the key?" Jazz demanded urgently. Hannah saw Drew's balled-up fist and began clawing and prying at it.
"You're not leaving Tommy behind,"
Drew grunted at her.
"Tommy's gone."
She struggled against his tight grip, prying one finger loose.
"We have to leave him now."
Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes again as she said this last part.
"I'm sorry, Tommy,"
she said quietly.
"I'm so sorry."
Bending low over Drew, Hannah opened her mouth and bit hard into his wrist. He let out a pained yell and his hand popped open, freeing the key to fall to the floor. Spitting his wrist out, she fumbled for the key while still pinning Drew and tossed it to Jazz. Jazz climbed into the driver's seat and started the van. Flicking the lights on, she saw standing right next to the driver's door the gaunt, expressionless face staring down at her, its eyes flickering bright yellow. A cold, piercing chill grew in her chest, and her limbs began to feel heavy. Her mind began to fog over as she heard Drew's voice in her head. "It's all right. She's calling you. Go to her, Jazz." His voice reverberated through her. How nice it would be to let go, to not worry about anything anymore. Nothing would ever be a problem again. Just open the door and go to her, Drew's voice urged her. Jazz's hand reached out to grab the cold metal and pulled down on it. The van lurched backwards over the lumpy ground, crunching shrubs as it crawled away. Finally lifting her heavy, numb hand onto the wheel, she spun it around and pointed the nose of the van back up the path. Throwing it into drive, she pressed the gas pedal with what feeble strength she had left and sent the van climbing up the trail, rocking side to side as it lumbered through dips and sharp potholes. It took immense focus to keep the van on the trail. Just as they reached the top of the gorge, Jazz chanced a look in the rearview mirror to see a dark silhouette standing at the bottom of the hill, its glowing yellow eyes flickering as it watched the van trundle up and away from the gorge. Pulling onto the smooth road, Jazz found herself warming up. Her limbs no longer felt so numb and heavy, and she could focus and think clearly again. She pressed harder on the pedal and sped up on the dark country road. "So Tommy's gone then?" came Drew's voice from beneath Hannah. Focus came back into Hannah's eyes as she turned to acknowledge him beneath her. She put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed.
"Yeah, he's gone now."
Her voice broke as she spoke. She climbed off of him and began tending to his bleeding wrist to keep herself busy. Jazz looked in the mirror at the two of them. They were sitting in what was earlier a van full of smiling and laughing people. How they were going to explain themselves, none of them knew. Where did they go? Why were they there? Where are the others? They were going to be tough questions to answer. The hardest question, Drew thought to himself, was whether he would ever hear the inviting call again.